It's really always a pleasure to have you in. And now I turn to what you predicted, which was that the courts would turn back the tariffs. You suggested that the tariffs, which were imposed illegally, I mean, as Congress pulled back and sort of let the president lean in to his tariff policy, that even as it was being implemented, it ultimately would be judged as illegal. Bring us up to speed. Apparently, a major judicial judgment agrees with you.
Well, I was on News Nation yesterday, and I confidently predicted, they don't have a Katz photo of me like you do, Mark, but I confidently predicted, and I know I'm sticking my neck out a little bit, that even this U.S. Supreme Court will find that the tariffs imposed by Trump unilaterally and really arbitrarily are illegal. And the reason that I say that, it's gone up now to two courts. They're both obscure courts unless you practice in that field. One was that Court of International Trade that ruled against Trump several months ago, but he didn't say that Trump had to stop collecting the tariffs. So we're going to have that effect on the economy. It's percolating, but it's going to start really adding to more inflation, even if the Supreme Court does strike it down, because he's had it for several months. This is what we always joke about, Mark, that you have a right to not have the Constitution violated with Trump to the extent you have it, but he violates it for months and months anyway before the U.S. Supreme Court gets to it if they do the right thing. And of course, there are stays so that the ruling below doesn't go into effect right away. But after that court ruled against Trump, and yet he was allowed to keep collecting the tariffs because this stay didn't go into effect, then it went up to a court called the Federal Circuit, the Court of Appeals for the Federal Circuit. There are about 12 or 13 courts around the country, but there's two that are in Washington, D.C. One of them is the D.C. Circuit to handle cases in D.C. And so it doesn't have a first, second, third. But then there's this Court of Appeals for the Federal Circuit. Well, it got this case, and it took it en banc, and it voted 7-4 that these tariffs are illegal. One of the reasons that they're illegal is because the emergency that supposedly exists patently doesn't exist. And to the extent this case had a trial in the lower court, Trump could never prove that any real emergencies existed. The two supposed emergencies that allow him to use this emergency power to collect taxes without Congress weighing in on it are that drugs are coming into the country. Oh my God, there's gambling going on. There's drugs coming into the country. Well, this has, of course, been happening forever. And while fentanyl is very bad, we've had drugs like fentanyl, we've had cocaine, methamphetamine, you name it's been imported into the country. And that's not an emergency that suddenly just was emergent and that demanded action. And the other one is that, here's another one that you're going to be shocked by. We have a trade imbalance. Well, we've had a trade imbalance for years and years. We've also been, negatively, we've been financing the government with borrowed money also for decades. So none of this is an emergency. This was just performative. And then, of course, Trump uses it to twist arms around the world and tell, like Vietnam, we're going to hit you with a really high tariff unless you approve a Trump hotel in Vietnam. It's so shocking. It's unbelievable. If this were happening in any other country, the State Department, which has also been emasculated under Trump, would be screaming, oh my God, this is a banana republic. This is pay to play. We're going to impose sanctions on this country that's doing exactly what Trump is doing. And of course, Trump is being empowered by the U.S. Supreme Court ruling a couple of years ago on presidential immunity. So he can actually take that sort of what I view as a clear bribe, quid pro quo from Vietnam, but because it's an official act, you could prove it. He could have said to the Vietnamese premier, he could have said, approve my Trump hotel or you will pay double the tariffs. You hear me loud and clear? You could have that on a recording, and under the U.S. Supreme Court ruling, that kind of quid pro quo would be allowed.
Yeah, but what you just described actually did happen. I mean, not, as you say, maybe not explicitly, as you've just mentioned, but there was the implicit notion that if we grant this guy approval of his resort in Vietnam, he'll drop the tariffs. They granted it. They moved a bunch of people. The area that the resort takes up, people live there. They had to move those people out.
Would say, Trump property approved, Vietnam tariffs went down. You could put that on a bumper sticker.
That's right. And it actually did happen. But now to the legal part, though. Please just follow through. So Trump is saying, I'm taking this to the Supreme Court.
Trump
My
immediately asked for
concierge
a stay.
Supreme Court will
Right.
rule
Trump
with
went
me.
to the U.S. Supreme Court, right,
Yeah.
and immediately asked for a stay of that 7-4 ruling. And he asked that the Court of Appeals granted the stay. Even though they ruled against Trump 7-4, they granted the stay so that Trump could keep collecting the tariffs. Now, he says deceptively, hey, we've collected twice as much for the federal revenues by collecting twice the amount of tariffs that we did. Of course, you could always collect more money in tariffs. It's the effect that it has on the economy and prices in America. So once you add the billions and billions of dollars added to what consumers are going to have to pay all over the country, it's a nothing burger to collect double the amount of tariffs at the customs window. So that's what he says. But there are a couple of interesting things about the U.S. Supreme Court taking cert. And I suppose it would have been remarkable if they'd have just denied cert and said, okay, that's it. The appellate ruling goes into effect. It's just such a big deal. It's a big deal because of the harm it's going to have so many ways around. So I expect them to rule pretty soon whether the whether the government can keep collecting those tariff payments. If the Supreme Court says stop collecting the tariff payments, that will tell you which way they're going to rule. Because that is something that if they're going to rule the way I think they're going to rule, and they conference these cases pretty early, especially if they have 5 or 6 votes, that looks like they're going to rule the way I think they are going to rule, because I think they're going to do the right thing on this economic issue. They've got to stop the tariffs from being collected, because there's going to be a huge recoupment when they finally rule, as I think they will, in favor of these businesses. And that is truly an administrative nightmare. Now, Trump argues, look at what an administrative nightmare it would be, U.S. Supreme Court, if you followed the law and ruled against us. Of course, you can't create an administrative snafu and nightmare and then tell a court, oh my God, look at a mess it's going to be if this court does the right thing. Look at the mess that I've made. I'm going to take so much effort to clean up the mess that I made. Judge, rule the other way. But that's exactly what the Trump administration is saying. The good news is that the Treasury Secretary apparently has a plan B, how this is all going to get undone and how they are going to allow the recoupments. And I guess you can give people credits. That'll kind of work, Mark. I mean, just in terms of business, I have a client who actually deals with the port. This is like a real thing for him and all these other small and medium-sized businesses. And you can go bankrupt waiting for this thing to be.
I was just about to say, small businesses, I didn't mean to interrupt, but I was just about to make the point. Small business has been dramatically affected. Many have gone under. I've made this point repeatedly over the last few weeks, because these are withering taxes on small businesses that are already operating oftentimes on small margins. So, they have real damages, David. They could sue the U.S. government for having imposed these illegal taxes and having cost them their business.
I think most of those countries are going to make a deal. Nobody wants a trade war with the United States. A trade war hurts everybody. Trump is performative. He acts like, he's the big dominant monkey. And he's the big dominant monkey because the U.S. market's so huge. And of course, our consumer market is what every manufacturing company wants to sell to. But let's say that you're India right now. India has this ridiculous 50% rate. It has the highest rate in the world. Things fell apart dramatically with Modi, who's not exactly a non-authoritarian leader himself. He's kind of like a little bit the Trump of India, this Modi guy. And it looked like they were having this sort of a love letter affair that he was having with that North Korean dictator the first time around. Now, Modi, in fairness to him, does manage to get himself elected. I don't agree with his policies, but he does manage to get himself elected. Apparently, Trump said he should win the Nobel Peace Prize for solving the India-Pakistan question, which, if you know anything about the history of India and Pakistan, is so outlandish on so many levels. It's the kind of ignorance which is almost unfathomable. Millions of people died after the partition. They're still fighting each other. They have Kashmir divided, but he wants the Nobel Peace Prize because he solved the. It's like Modi saying to him, we ought to get I'm Modi, the head of India. I ought to get the Nobel Peace Prize because I've solved all the problems between the United States and pick 'em, Venezuela, the United States and Cuba, the United States and Russia. And so this apparently made things deteriorate. And then they went off the hinges, and now tariffs are at 50%. So if this gets thrown out, they're going to modify the tariffs. Of course, the tariffs will come down. And the good news will be that what the Supreme Court, I think, will say in this case, I think they have about 6 votes to say this. I think Roberts and, Amy Coney Barrett, maybe even Gorsuch and Kavanaugh get the fact that this really is that you cannot find anywhere in the Constitution or in that emergency law that the president has the power to do this without Congress. Now, what the Republicans did, Mark, is they just stepped aside. They figured their voters wouldn't really get this. Yeah, prices would go up, but they wouldn't really blame their senator. So the Republican senators figured they could get away with this and not rein him in. And of course, Trump's position is that he can do this because Congress has acquiesced in it. And Congress hasn't reined him in. So people like me who say, well, Congress has to be involved, his argument is that they were involved. They have the power to rein me in. These are emergency provisions. And I took these emergency provisions and I made myself the dominant monkey of tariffs all over the world. And I squeezed all these countries around the world. And I got my golf courses approved around the world. But the Senate didn't stop me. They could have, and they didn't. And they almost stopped him with Canada. Our relations with Canada have totally deteriorated, and tourism from Canada is way down, Mark. But they were within a vote, I think, of stopping him from making this tariff trouble with Canada that he was making. But they couldn't even get the votes to do that. And they certainly never got the votes to make him do something rational over tariffs and to stay within his lane as the president. So hopefully the Supreme Court, and I think they will on this one, they will say that Congress has to be involved. Congress will get involved. And they'll straighten out the tariffs with all these countries, which, the Constitution does say that Congress, right? Article 1, that the Article 1 Congress, that's the center of our government, has specific authority over taxes and duties. It specifically says taxes and duties are to be set by Congress.
They vacated that responsibility. I mean, Trump's not wrong in thinking, hey, you guys, if you had a problem with it, you should have said something type thing. I mean, no one wants to say anything. And this is interesting because it speaks to what Randy's just saying this in the chat. Trump should just go to Congress on all the tariff stuff. Congress will pass anything Trump wants them to. I don't know about that on tariffs now. Would you agree with me, David Katz?
Yeah.
I don't know if he can squeak that through this crew.
Right. You take North Dakota. North Dakota has 2 Republican senators. They're very reliant on trade with Canada. Those North Dakota senators, Republicans, don't want to stand up and say, yeah, we put a huge duty on Canada, and yeah, their wood is not coming in, and yeah, our construction industry is collapsed in North Dakota because I voted for this. But they think they're 2 or 3 steps removed from their voters really getting it and punishing them at the polls, even though those North Dakota senators are absolutely responsible for not standing up to it. So no, this would not win. These guys all want to, they want to preserve their jobs. Right. And they're scared of Trump coming in with his MAGA base and primarying them. Well, but they're scared of other things too. They're scared of doing something which is so obvious. I mean, a Democrat could beat them if they voted for some of these things. And they're very trade conscious. A lot of these, a lot of these states, but they hide behind it because they haven't voted on it. And when the Supreme Court hopefully rules as it does, they'll just say, Trump, he went off the rails, and now we're settling the whole.
You've kind of addressed this, but question for Mr. Katz from Chaplain Fred. Thanks for the $10 super chat. If Trump is collecting tariffs as we speak, what is going to happen with the money collected thus far? Is Trump keeping it? Well, I don't think
Trump's figured out how to keep the crypto money. He's apparently kept $4 billion just in the months since he's been president.
Yeah, the crypto thing is an absolute payoff.
He's
yeah,
stuck right in his pocket. And I'm sure he's thinking of some way to stick this money in his pocket. But so far, at least so far as we know, this money will not go into his pocket. So what will happen to it? They'll make requests for recoupment. They'll say, and they keep very good records. I mean, everybody in importing now is keeping a record of how much they're owed had the tariffs not been imposed on them. And then they'll make a case if the government doesn't settle with them. They'll go to the Court of Claims and they'll say, hey, you owe me $89,000.03 because I overpaid my tariffs. And then the huge big boys will probably, they'll do the accounting thing where it gets credited back to them. Right. Like I said, the big boys, most of them haven't gone broke over this. So that's what will happen. Now, let's just to talk about this very briefly. If the Supreme Court does affirm this, this is just a disaster because, they always act like, one thing that kept both parties in line, Mark, was they realized what goes around comes around. But this MAGA crowd that's in power right now, they act like there's never going to be another election. I know people are really scared. There's not going to be another fair election where they really count the votes and do everything proper election. But, politicians, including like presidents, have always believed what goes around comes around. And if you want to do stuff like this, I mean, imagine this wielded by a Democratic president. He doesn't have either house. He doesn't have either house. Now, it's true that enough senators could stop him from doing this because they would stand up to him. But if it were close, let's say it was the last time where there were 51 or 52 Democratic senators, but you couldn't count on the coal guy Democrat, and you couldn't count on the flaky lady from Arizona who loved the carried interest financiers who backed her.
Yeah,
and so
Manson Cinema. Yeah.
Yeah, you never kind of knew what was going to happen with those folks. It would seem like, Biden could have done this too. And, Democrats haven't historically had a taste for this, but you could have a guy who had a woman who had a real taste for this. And to do, I mean, we're so used to what Trump does, and he does it every day, and we get, we try to be alert to everything. But, you can imagine a really powerful, forceful Democrat doing this. You can basically run the foreign policy of this country, not the Senate, not the law, not the House. You as president could run, you just tell somebody, okay, you got to pay 70% tariffs. And all of a sudden you have, you've really controlled. You don't need treaties. You don't need the House. You don't need the Senate. This power, if the U.S. Supreme Court votes the other way, everyone's going to have an emergency. Next president is going to have an emergency, can do whatever they want. If having a negative trade balance in the United States and having drugs come into the country, if those are emergencies, everything's an emergency. And the president just does whatever they want to with every country in the world, punishing some, rewarding others, sticking money in their pocket.
Yeah, I mean, it's just opening a door to immense corruption, and also irresponsible, chaotic policy. I mean, this is kind of where we are now. I want to ask you about, you mentioned the voting. I want to ask you about what's happened with the seizing of voting machines. So the Justice Department now has begun an effort to look at voting machines in Missouri. They want this voting equipment. It's odd that they chosen Missouri because Missouri was a state that Trump won. But in a way, it's not odd that they've chosen seizing voting machines because Trump doesn't want voting equipment. He doesn't want mail-in voting. And this is just sort of a way that he's maligning the integrity of voting systems, right? And so the Justice Department, again, wants this voting equipment used by 2 Republican clerks in Missouri during the 2020 election. And so apparently the request was rejected. But I'm wondering about so much has been said about the voting machines. There's the whole lawsuit with Dominion voting systems and them being disparaged by right-wing media. Ultimately, as it turns out, the integrity of those voting systems was pretty well not only upheld, but the court judgments landed pretty heavily on Fox and on OAN, I think. They had to write huge checks. Tell me to what degree the Justice Department has the right to go in and demand these voting machines, and what could possibly happen there?
Well, even for Rupert Murdoch, $787 million was more than walking around money, right? So they paid huge for defaming Dominion. And just to remember, this was the disgraceful presenters on the Fox, not the ones that I go on with, but you know that crowd that's on. I think that was the Tucker Carlson. I think that was a part of his demise. That Bartolino, I think.
Bartiromo,
yeah. So that was a huge debacle, and some of them still have lawsuits. I think Newsmax, the even further right-wing station than Fox, I think they just settled. Check me on that, but I think they just settled for a very large sum over this same thing. And there's another one called Smartmatic, which I think was also defamed. It also has lawsuits going against some of those folks. So, and the things that they said were just totally outrageous. Somehow Hugo Chavez down in, he and his cronies down there in Venezuela had rigged those machines, and those machines are still rigged. And I don't know how they got them to go from voting for Hugo Chavez to Joe Biden, but supposedly that's what they were doing, and they weren't counting the votes properly. And then every time they checked one of them, they were voting. They were counting the votes properly, and there was no there. And they kept putting that story on Fox night after night. And then, of course, Newsmax was putting it on their station, too, because Fox was the first one, ironically, that had called, I think it was Arizona, for Biden. And so the Fox viewers, the real MAGA ones, were furious. They didn't want to watch Fox anymore because they were telling them something they didn't want to hear. They went over to Newsmax in large numbers, Mark, and then they came back to Fox, generally speaking. And now Newsmax is actually suing Fox as of a couple of days ago, saying that they are engaging in anti-competitive practices, that Fox is doing all those things. So in terms of getting these machines, I guess the reason they're doing it in Missouri is it's a red state. If they tried to do it in California, every official would say, are you crazy? You have no right to, do we have a right to look at all these federal things that we're kind of curious about? No, this is state property. This thing was properly conducted. There's no evidence. And no, you can't just rummage around because you want to rummage around. This guy in Missouri, I think he went to the White House or something. So they got a guy from Missouri who's a MAGA. He went to the White House where he's a MAGA. He probably knows people. He thought somehow he could inveigle them to give the voting machines or access to the voting machines. And you say that even that hasn't worked. And it's they're going to, they're going to make some kind of mischief. Who's going to watch over that? Oh, excuse me, Kash Patel, Bongino. Oh no, the Deputy Attorney General. He's going to come and make sure that it's all totally clean. Nobody believes the Department of Justice anymore. It is geared toward justice with Epstein. And how about with this thing? You'd have to videotape it. And whatever they found, if they said, oh my goodness, this machine was rigged in a certain way, nobody would believe it. And you worry that they would rig it. And then they would be all ready for the performance and they'd show it to the world and say, oh my God, it's rigged. It's rigged. And maybe Kash Patel or Bondi would hold a press conference. And who would be impressed by any of it? The people who want to believe, I guess they would believe. But, the people in the middle, they've so lost credibility, Mark. It's, as a former assistant U.S. attorney, it's just so sad how the Department of Justice has lost credibility.
Yeah, I mean, everything's been degraded. And you understand that this investigation into the 2020 election is all part of Trump's jihad, which is associated with pursuing that big lie, which is that the election was stolen. So your tax money and my tax money is going to the continued investigation at the Justice Department to that election lie. They're essentially reverse engineering. They're starting with the notion that this election was stolen in 2020. Trump actually had won it. Now let's find evidence to support that conclusion. And so this is all in service of that. And so, again, when it comes to the actual work of the Justice Department, the kind of work that you did when you were a federal prosecutor, et cetera, it's all being diverted, much of it, in ways like this to support the Mad King's assertion. And so to me, it's an affront. I mean, it's insulting. But the other thing that's going on in Washington, where you used to work, is the District of Columbia is being occupied by National Guard forces. And there are a lot of those troops that are picking up trash and they're, taking graffiti off of walls. That's all great. I love the beautification of Washington, D.C. I'm sure it could be done at a fraction of the price and also without the inconvenience of National Guard troops, all of whom have real jobs as real estate agents, as accountants, and they're now called upon by the president to be props in this ridiculousness in Washington, D.C. So the district is suing, and they're asking a federal court to intervene on this troop involvement in civilizing Washington, reducing crime, whatever the end goal as stated is. DC wants those troops out, and they're going to court to try to make it happen.
Well, the president has power in DC more than he does in any other city. So this is not, whatever ends up happening in DC doesn't mean that any of it would work in Chicago or in New York City. In terms of what happened in Los Angeles, the judge up in San Francisco did finally rule. There's a trial, a final judgment. People are very confused at what happened there because he said that what Trump had done here, invading, LA on a pretext, saying that there was uncontrollable violence when there was not at all. He had issued an injunction, and then that was overturned 2-1 by the appellate court, saying that his injunction couldn't go into effect. But that returned the case to the trial judge up in San Francisco. It's confusing, who was trying the case of what happened here in LA. After a 3-day trial, he finally ruled that this was a violation of what they call the Posse Comitatus Act, which is a 19th century law, which sensibly says that, we don't want to be a military dictatorship. We don't want troops, army troops, military troops who are supposed to fight the enemy going against Americans and making Americans the enemy. And so therefore they cannot perform law enforcement functions. And so Trump's argument in that case, which was just repudiated by the trial judge up there, and this would be a great precedent. It wouldn't actually control because it's a trial court, so it doesn't control. If he went into Chicago, that wouldn't be a precedent that would bind the courts in Chicago, but it's extremely persuasive. He's a very good, very careful judge. He's actually the younger brother of Supreme Court Justice Breyer, who just resigned. He gave up his seat, and his former clerk actually got that seat. She's one of the three on the U.S. Supreme Court. But anyway, this judge up there, highly respected, did a really good job on the case, said what was really obvious to everyone except, I guess, the two Trumpy judges on the Ninth Circuit that had stopped the injunction from going into effect down here, that yes, federal troops can protect federal buildings. If they're about to burn down a building, yes, the federal troops can come in lest they burn down a building. But the idea that you're sending federal people around, it could be IRS agents. Think about that, right wingers, when the shoe's on the other foot. They could be IRS agents. They could be ICE agents. They could be EPA inspectors. The fact that there are federal workers doesn't mean that you could send Army troops anywhere the federal workers go on the pretext that they're protecting federal workers. That was Trump's pretext, that ICE was going places, that the ICE officers needed more protection. You had these federal people who were at risk, and therefore you could call out the Army to protect the people and go everywhere that the people went. Anyway, that's what the court said you can't do. That's going to stand, Mark. We are not a military dictatorship. There are not 5 votes on the U.S. Supreme Court, in my opinion, who are going to say we're that kind of. And I think Trump knows that. So I think when he talks about going into Chicago, that would be the same law that would apply to L.A. He's going to find a judge there. He's going to find the Seventh Circuit there who is not going to approve of that. All that the federal troops can get called out to do is a true insurrection. And another court also just found that even if you think that the Venezuelans coming here en masse was sort of an invasion, as like the third use of the word invasion, that's not what the Constitution or the laws mean by an invasion or insurrection. So unless there's a real invasion, there's a real insurrection, and the local authorities can't put it down, or you're protecting federal buildings. What happened to us in LA was illegal. I think the Ninth Circuit, when it comes back to them, is going to say it's illegal, and the Supreme Court's either going to not take it or they're going to say it's illegal.
First on the Nullifidian says ICE is armed, but they need more protection. Yeah, exactly. There's
That's what's astonishing. And they just got these billions and billions of dollars. The idea that they can't protect themselves on these raids. And like I said, what goes around comes around. There are so many tax evaders in all these red states. Okay. I'm sure there are some people who send this to their friends in red states or who sympathize that way. Okay. So here comes Newsom. He wants to do something as president about all these tax cheats. A lot of them are in red states. And my God, if you think ICE agents couldn't really protect themselves, how about these poor IRS agents who are running around doing audit after audit after audit of all these red state tax cheats? They need the Army to be brought out to go around with the IRS to all these red states because that's what this case is going to hold that they can do. And I think the U.S. Supreme Court and the Ninth Circuit is going to take a deep breath and say, no, that's not what we're doing. That's not. But
again, to draw the distinction, you're saying that the president does have the power to deploy the National Guard in Washington, and
that's different.
I get it. But D.C. Again, they have an elected attorney general there as well. And he is suing. This guy, Brian Schwab, is suing. He's saying that this is an illegal deployment. Now, you're saying, that case probably won't fly. But obviously,
I'm just saying whatever they decide there is not precedent for Chicago
and
LA. It's going to involve the D.C. home rule. Congress did give home rule to D.C. This is going to depend on what the parameters are of the home rule. I think probably what Trump is doing in Washington is also illegal. I think without Congress changing the law, the Home Rule Act. So I think he needs an act of Congress. Congress is not. But what people need to realize is that these are all things that would be subject to the filibuster. So there are not 60 votes in the Senate to do any of these things. Everyone who says that Trump has to go to Congress and the Congress will do whatever Trump wants. No, the Congress will. They did the big ugly bill, and that's probably about all they're really going to do. And that one didn't need 60 votes. Remember, that was this reconciliation thing. He doesn't have 60 votes for almost anything he wants to do in the Senate.
Yeah, and I'll just make the point that 2 points actually. One is that he wants to extend and will extend the National Guard presence in D.C. Don't know that it'll actually involve troops there through December, but that's what they have said. They want to extend, and they've talked to the Pentagon about this, the extension of this presence in Washington, D.C. And the cops in D.C. have new rules. They are pursuing vehicles when D.C. cops would not normally pursue vehicles, and the Interior Secretary has thanked Trump for allowing them to chase, quote, bad guys. The U.S. Park Police have initiated 10 car chases in the past 3 weeks as part of this surge in federal law enforcement there in D.C., and there have been 6 major accidents, crashes as a result of these pursuits. So Washington has its own degree of chaos. And the last thing I'll just remind everybody, something we talked about before, when you look at the open table reservations and the other polling of restaurants around Washington, D.C., there's been such a substantial decline in restaurant reservations and in patrons into restaurants. It's extraordinary. It's over 50% month to month. So this idea, and it's just propaganda, that D.C. is flourishing somehow with a National Guard presence, it's just utter absurdity. Yeah.
If you're planning a trip to Washington, D.C. in the fall, come out here to California this fall. We'll treat you right. We need the business, right? Our port is way down because of the tariffs. Our restaurants and a lot of industries here are completely screwed up because people are scared to go to work. So we need the business. So and the other thing that's ridiculous, one of the huge problems with crime, of course, random crime, people who are mentally ill, that kind of crime, of course, that's a huge problem. If you just randomly get mugged or something, that's a huge problem. But then another one is organized crime. People who commit organized crimes are very good at keeping away. I think I said this on your show once before, from narcs, from snitches, from cops. The idea that these army guys, right, all dressed in their fatigues, are really going to, number one, deter organized crime is kind of ridiculous. And it would be a disaster. We don't want them. They're not trained to do this. They're going to go into Anacostia and do what? They're going to march down the street in the highest crime area. Chicago, too. They're going to walk through one of these areas that's, basically controlled by some huge street gang, a la, what was that? New Jack City. They're going to go through the New Jack City of Chicago and do what? There they are. And do what? They're going to go undercover. They're going to be immediately spotted. This would be nothing but a disaster that they would try to fight crime. Meanwhile, the people who know how to fight organized crime, like the FBI, are taking off their wiretaps and taking off the things that the FBI knows how to do to really go after organized crime and to not get made. What are they doing? I'm not making this up, Mark, over 1,000 went through the Epstein tapes. No doubt they found so many references to Trump and to Trump's donors that they said, you know what, it's going to be nothing but blackouts and redactions, so to hell with this project. But before they did that, 1,000 FBI agents got taken off fighting organized crime, fighting real crime, to go do that nonsense. And on top of that, they run around with their FBI jackets along with these ICE guys and bring down the reputation of the FBI for years and years to come. That's all a lot of people are going to remember. Oh yeah, the FBI and the ICE, they went into that car wash and they took all of those nice, hardworking people there. I remember that. They were standing there with a lady who was being separated from her daughter, crying her eyes out because she'd been there 15 years. That's what they're going to remember. They remember the FBI jacket, and they remember that crying lady separated from her daughter. And the FBI special agents hate it. But Kash Patel and Bongino send them there, and they either quit, right? They either quit or they follow orders.
It's a smear, and on top of a smear. I want to change completely and pivot to a case that is in Texas. Texas is moving to allow anyone to sue abortion pill prescribers and distributors. The measure aims to stop the flow of pills into Texas from blue states. It could open package delivery services up to fines, along with doctors and drug distribution firms. The bill is backed by anti-abortion activists, passed in the state Senate yesterday. It allows private citizens to sue companies and individuals who manufacture or distribute abortion pills to patients in Texas. Winning plaintiffs would get a minimum of $100,000 in damages. Abbott, who is the governor there, is expected to sign the legislation into law, and included in the bill, they've actually included this bill on the agenda, I should say, for the state's 2 special sessions this summer, which have largely been dedicated to redistricting. As you know, we've talked about it, and also the July floods. Can you speak to this, the latest attempt to curb the increasing popularity and availability of medication abortion?
Well, first of all, you have to start checking where your connecting flight may go through. You don't want to go through Houston, Dallas, or San Antonio for real, because they could have a warrant for someone's arrest from another state. And a lot of these shield laws don't let them extradite you from one state to another. So they don't allow some poor pharmacist who's just prescribing medication and ends up on a list and ends up maybe being sued. And so I don't think that they're going to allow these shield laws. I think are going to protect you from civil lawsuits if they come into, let's say, Massachusetts, or they come into New York or Illinois, and they try to sue you, or they try to get, let's say, they get indictment against you. But no kidding, you got to be careful to go into one of those states. It's the old thing, jurisdiction. If they have their hands on you, they have jurisdiction. And they check you, in an airport, you get in the flight and stuff like that. And if you're in the computer that there's a lawsuit, you could be served in Texas, you could be arrested in Texas. So, Texas is about to sort of box themselves out of the country with all this crazy.
But wait a minute. Let me just follow up on that. Are you saying that if I'm involved in as a doctor and having provided a prescription for this medication, or if I'm involved as you're not speaking to who would be the people who you're talking about who would have warrants out for their arrest in Texas? What group of people?
I guess they could say that the nurse was in a conspiracy.
I see. Okay.
Prescribed it. They could say that the person who shipped it was in the conspiracy. So they get 7 people from the prescribing, from maybe the clinician, maybe the person at the pharmacy, everybody in the chain. And they did it. There was somebody who was having an ugly divorce down there, and I guess he got a hold of her prescription and her trail on her internet, and he found the 6 or 7 people who were responsible for her getting her, medical abortion pills. And so that becomes either a lawsuit or it becomes a prosecution. This Paxton down there. So he goes into, this is a real thing. Like I said, as long as you're in Massachusetts, you're in Illinois, I think the fact that they want to sue you, they would treat it as rubbish if they tried to, have the one state cooperate with the other state. Illinois or New York would say, are you kidding? We're not even going to, you tried to serve process there. They wouldn't, the sheriff wouldn't come to your house. Nobody would serve process. But meanwhile, the indictment's sitting out there in Texas. So as I say, you want to be very, very careful. You don't go through, people take Southwest, they go through San Antonio. They don't think a thing about it at all. They run your name in the computer. There's a warrant for your arrest. Okay. Stay out of Texas.
Well, what about the women who want this pill in Texas? Aren't they the real victims here as well?
I don't think that they're crazy enough in Texas yet to prosecute the women, but if you need the medical abortion, obviously, I think they do everything they can. It comes in a brown wrapper. Right. You still need to get a warrant. This lady had the bad luck that her husband, I guess, had access to the property. They were in a divorce. He turned it over. It was probably a consent search because he had a right to consent to the property that they were jointly living in. They still need a search warrant. So there are still some protections procedurally, how they're going to find out that you, Mary Smith, was ordering this medical abortion pill from a pharmacy in Massachusetts. But, this was what the U.S. Supreme Court, this is what they're going to be 100 years from now, Mark. That's what that U.S. Supreme Court's going to be known for. They're going to be known for Dobbs. They're going to be known for the monstrosity that they perpetrated among the American people, and especially women. And every one of their names, Chief Justice Roberts, he thinks he'll be known for other things. He'll probably be known for that and the presidential immunity. And they may be his 2 Dred Scott cases.
Yeah, I mean, it's an extraordinary thing, but you're absolutely right. The judge ruling that Google can keep Chrome. It has to share some of its search engine data with rivals. That was pretty huge. Google was looking at really being broken up. So this is a pretty big deal on the part of the U.S. government the U.S. government was trying to break up Google, essentially. Google
basically won. The stock market reflected that. Google went up. The other remedies would have been worse. This remedy that had to share the code and stuff like that, boy, is that going to be hard to enforce. There'll be loads and loads of lawsuits. They'll say, they'll always say that they shared the code, and the competitors will always say, no, they didn't. They sabotaged it in all kinds of ways. It wasn't really useful to us. And the judge, who seems like a very good judge, was persuaded that all the other remedies were worse. that they sort of needed the funding. It sounds very, very technical, but basically the way that you always go to Google is not an accident. The way you always go to Google first is something that Google pays billions of dollars to Apple and others, that you go to Google first. And so they actually went to court and they told the judge there, without those billions of dollars, we'd really be in trouble. If we didn't get those billions of dollars to send everybody who buys an Apple product to Google, Apple, the others, would really be in trouble. We really need that revenue. And they showed the judge, I guess, that they really need that revenue. I mean, I don't know the case inside and out, but I would have broken them up.
Clearly, Google is, an immense company. A lot of these companies are Meta. I put in the same category with control over Instagram and WhatsApp and Facebook. These are methods of communication and information, and you have really a lock on it. It's again, in a free
how about a little private pleading, Mark? Send them all to the Mark Thompson show, especially on Thursday.
Thank you very much. I want to, last thing I just want to review, because you always talk about the fact that essentially the Trump administration, it might take a while, but they are losing in court. I thought the Harvard judgment was an example of that. The Trump administration found to have illegally frozen billions in Harvard funding. This is research funding, and a federal judge in Boston handing Harvard University a legal victory. This just happened yesterday. It's the latest in this high-profile legal fight over whether the administration, the Trump regime, acted illegally when it froze more than $2.2 billion in Harvard research funding in response to allegations of campus anti-Semitism. So this is a serious win for Harvard and setback for Trump and friends.
Well, yes, the judge had one phrase where she said that Harvard was plagued by anti-Semitism. So that's all that the right wingers are featuring about that case. That even a Democratic appointed judge said that they've been plagued by anti-Semitism, and however bad the anti-Semitic actions might have been, that was a very poor choice of words. I think plagued by anti-Semitism.
Well, she also said it's difficult to conclude anything other than, this is a quote, that the Trump administration used anti-Semitism as a smokescreen for a targeted, ideologically motivated assault on this country's premier universities, and did so in a way that runs afoul of federal law. So she made that point as well.
That's the headline. I'm just saying she lost the headline. She lost a little bit of the impact of the case, which was tremendously anti-Trump and anti-Trump's actions, because she said that there was no correlation between, they're taking money away from these labs. And she said something interesting. She said, for all we know, there's a lot of Jewish people working in those labs. This is not even helping the problem that you say you're addressing. You say you're going to do something about anti-Semitism, and you defund a bunch of labs that, for all we know, have a very high amount of Jewish people, working in them. So how are you even supposedly helping Jewish people? And of course, this whole, canard of anti-Semitism. I'm Jewish myself. I don't buy that it was anywhere near the level that the propagandists have said that there was. There were demonstrations, and a lot of them were pro-Palestinian. You can certainly understand that with what's going on in Gaza, what's going on with these runaway settlements all over territory, which is not Israel's. You can certainly understand why there was all this anti-Israel protest. That doesn't mean it's anti-Semitic. And to equate those two is a complete false equivalency. And that's been a large part of what's, I think, inspired Trump. But she said that the $2 billion had no correlation. And I think that Harvard is going to play this all the way to victory, and God bless them, because I think that they have really shown, now they have a huge endowment, over $50-60 billion. So they could afford to fight. And I think they could afford to keep those labs open. Columbia was worried that they'd done 20 years of research to combat cancer, and it was all going to go down the drain because they couldn't keep the research studies going. That's a real reason to, quote, capitulate. That's a real reason to settle. I don't blame Columbia for that. Harvard had the money and the grit to fight. And, Harvard's done two things really right. All of those D students in the Trump administration weren't admitted to Harvard. That was right. And number two, they fought those ding-dongs when they went after them. And partly it was because they were Harvard. That's why they were, red meat for the ding-dongs. And I just can't believe that the anti-Semitism reached anything near the level that Trump and the others like to posture that it did.
We're out of time. David Katz, you're so cool to spend this kind of time with us. We'll look for you on News Nation. I think you're on the weekends a lot as as a political analyst and as sort of a legal analyst. You're across the board on. I think you're being wherever they can track you down, they use you as I say, across the English speaking world. But we love you on the Thursdays here, and David Katz and I had a great personal face-to-face, which was we need to do. I think we should do a monthly on that. I'd love to visit with you.
Never been anything like this.
Yes.
Next month, I don't want to show off, but I enjoyed it immensely, and it's still going on. The U.S. Open tennis from New York, and I was there.
Now, were you there?
Yeah, I was there with my wife. We were there.
Wow.
I know we were there Saturday night, and we were there the Labor Day night. And there's a great match, the men's, a great match tonight. And I bought Mark a hat, which says,
I love that.
I want to see him soon and give him the hat. You can also order them. They're overpriced, but they do say U.S. Open, and they have the year. They're kind of a cool thing in any kind of color. I have unlike Trump, I have no personal interest in what I'm talking about. If this were Trump, he'd be getting a 40% cut of the hat.
I'll trade you with the Mark Thompson show hat for the U.S. Open. But that's right. It came out of nowhere, and I thought, oh my God, are you at the U.S. Open? I was watching tennis. I love tennis, of course, and to me, it would be a dream to go really enjoy the U.S. Open like that. Oh, you already have a pillow. I forgot.
And you have a very comfortable pillow. So
yeah.
I love the Mark Thompson merch, but you got a U.S. Open 2025, and
I'm excited.
Tonight's men's is supposed to be just terrific.
We'll do the trade over. Yeah, tonight's match will be unreal. We'll do the trade over lunch. Look forward to it. David Katz, everybody.
Great to be with you.
Hi, it's Mark, and I thought that was great. Hit the notification bell. You'll know whenever there's a new video being dropped, and please subscribe to our channel to help us save the universe.